In October 1972, the bodybuilding world came to a halt to witness a spectacle destined to make history. The chosen stage was Essen, in what was then West Germany, a city breathing modernity and rebuilding itself after turbulent decades. And it was there, inside the traditional Handelshof, that the 8th Mr. Olympia lifted its curtain, carrying with it the hunger of a crowd eager for muscle, glory, and rivalry. This edition wasn't just another contest. It was meant to be a milestone, a turning point that would shape the very course of the so-called golden era of bodybuilding. It's worth noting this was only the second time Olympia crossed the Atlantic. Up until then, the sacred stage of bodybuilding seemed exclusive to the United States, birthplace of the IFBB and the rise of legends. Choosing Germany was no small detail. It symbolized the sport's global expansion and the desire to prove that bodybuilding could captivate crowds anywhere on Earth. It was a bold step, opening horizons for the sport beyond American borders. And if the setting was new, so were the expectations. The 1972 Olympia already carried the aura of being one of the most anticipated events of all time. Fans, experts, and even the athletes themselves knew Essen was about to host one of the fiercest rivalries the sport had ever seen. The feeling was undeniable. Something epic was about to unfold, something that wouldn't be repeated with the same intensity again. What made this event so special? Part of it was Olympia's own journey up to that point. Since its creation in 1965, the contest had grown year by year in prestige, crowning champions and drawing more and more media attention. But by 1972, it had evolved into something else entirely. It was no longer just a showcase of physiques. It had become an arena of strategy, larger-than-life personalities, and battles that went way beyond aesthetics. The atmosphere wasn't confined to backstage or among the competitors. The fans, who were falling more and more in love with the culture of physical perfection, packed the seats, buzzing with anticipation. It wasn't just about who had the biggest arms or the tiniest waist. It was about who had the charisma, the presence, and the stage intelligence to win over the judges and the roaring crowd. At the same time, Olympia had already established itself as the ultimate measuring stick of bodybuilding worldwide. If you wanted to prove you were truly the best, it wasn't enough to win local titles or even the prestigious Mr. Universe. The Olympia was where the giants clashed head-to-head. No excuses, no second chances. And in Essen, in 1972, that truth would be tested like never before. So, when the lights came on that night in Germany, the audience knew they weren't just about to watch another contest. They were witnessing a crucial chapter in the history of the sport. The 8th Mr. Olympia wouldn't be remembered only for the physiques flexed on stage, but for the aura of rivalry, controversy, and passion that would mark it forever. The 1972 Olympia wasn't just a competition. It was a constellation of legends sharing the same stage, shaping what we now call the Golden Era. Leading the lineup was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the reigning two-time champ and heavy favorite. Already nicknamed the Austrian Oak, Arnold had won over the crowd not only with his jaw-dropping muscle mass, but also with his charisma and the unshakable confidence he radiated every time he stepped on stage. Next to him stood Sergio Oliva, the legendary myth. A three-time champion between 1967 and 1969, Sergio was back after being disqualified the year before. For many fans, this was his chance to reclaim the throne that seemed rightfully his. Oliva wasn't just another competitor. He was a genetic marvel, with proportions that defied belief. His mere presence in the lineup guaranteed this Olympia would go down as historic. But the cast didn't stop there. Essen would also mark the pro debut of Serge Nubret, the Frenchman who turned heads with his flawless aesthetics. With elegant lines, balanced proportions, and a stage presence that bordered on artistic, Nubret wasn't there just to fill the lineup. He was out to prove that beauty of form could rival raw size and mass. Another name in the mix was Frank Zane, who would go on to win Olympia 3 times between 1977 and 1979. At that point, Zane was still carving his place among the giants, but his refined, symmetrical physique already stood out. He represented a different style of bodybuilding, focused more on harmony and definition than on sheer bulk. And then there was Franco Columbu, Arnold's inseparable friend and training partner, who would later win 2 Olympia titles of his own. Short, Compact and incredibly dense, the Italian amazed fans with his freakish strength and a physique that looked carved out of stone. Even though he was still in Arnold's shadow, Columbu was already showing flashes of the future champion he was destined to become. Rounding out the lineup was Edmund Karolwiks from Poland, invited by Serge Nubret. He was the least known of the group, with no major titles under his belt, but his presence reinforced the truly international flavor of the contest, proof that Olympia was starting to attract talent from all corners of the globe. Interestingly, out of this six-man lineup, for would eventually become Mr. Olympia champions at some point in history. That's why so many people still consider 1972 one of the most legendary stages bodybuilding has ever seen. It wasn't just another contest, it was a gathering of future icons. And the big question hanging in the air was simple. Which of these giants would carve his name in bold letters that night in Essen? If there was one reason why the 1972 Olympia stood out so much, it had a name. The rivalry between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sergio Oliva. Arnold came in riding high after two straight wins in 1970 and 1971, solidifying himself as the new face of bodybuilding. Sergio, the myth, carried the weight of 3 Olympia titles and the aura of being the only man truly capable of dethroning the Austrian oak. Sergio's absence in the 1971 Olympia only fueled the fire. He'd been disqualified for competing in an unsanctioned event, leaving a gap that fans felt deeply. Without Oliva, some saw Arnold's victory as incomplete. So, when Essen was announced as the stage for their long-awaited rematch, everyone knew this was the showdown that would settle the score. To the fans, this clash was bigger than sports. It symbolized two schools of bodybuilding. On one side, Sergio, a genetic freak with proportions that seemed to defy human limits and a stage presence that bent logic. On the other, Arnold, the master strategist, combining sheer size, charisma, and a competitive mind sharp enough to flip the game at any moment. Each public appearance only cranked up the hype. Bodybuilding magazines promoted it as the ultimate showdown, hyping it up like the Mr. Olympia version of a heavyweight title fight. Some even compared it to the Ali versus Frazier rivalry, but in muscle form. The vibe was clear. Essen was where the truth would be revealed. The athletes themselves felt the gravity of the moment. Arnold knew that if he beat Sergio again, he'd cement himself as the undisputed king of the era. Sergio, on the other hand, saw this Olympia as a shot to reclaim not just the title, but also the respect and prestige he'd lost the year before. It wasn't just about trophies, it was about legacy. The tension spread to everyone involved. Fans traveled across borders just to witness it live. Journalists called it the final everyone had been waiting for. And even the other competitors knew that no matter how well they performed, the spotlight would always be locked on Arnold and Sergio. The narrative was inescapable. Every pose, every glance only fed the story of their clash. So, when the two finally stepped on stage in Essen, the silence in the crowd was almost physical. Everyone knew they were about to witness the defining chapter of a rivalry that had already outgrown the sport itself. But the 1972 Olympia wasn't just remembered for the physiques, it was also about the mind games. And no one played that game better than Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even during prejudging, it became clear that Arnold would use every card he had, even subtle ones, to gain the edge. And the turning point didn't happen on a grand stage, but in a cramped, makeshift room with poor conditions. Spotting the disadvantage, Arnold casually suggested moving to another setup, with a crucial detail: a black backdrop. At first glance, it seemed like a small adjustment, but in reality, it was a masterstroke. The dark background made Arnold's lighter skin tone pop, highlighting his muscle definition and separation, while Sergio's darker complexion blended into the shadows, dulling his impact. Arnold had basically redrawn the battlefield in his favor, and he didn't stop there. During the comparisons, Arnold also stepped just slightly ahead of the lineup, so subtle most people wouldn't notice. But that tiny adjustment created the illusion that he was bigger, wider, and more imposing than he actually was on that day. For anyone watching from the audience, the visual impact was undeniable. These little maneuvers proved Arnold wasn't just a bodybuilder. He was a natural-born strategist. He understood that Olympia wasn't won only with biceps and lats, but with stage presence, perception, and psychology. Every detail mattered. and Arnold made sure to squeeze every advantage out of them. Sergio, on the other hand, relied on his sheer physical dominance. He believed his almost mythical physique would speak for itself. And honestly, in terms of raw structure, many considered him unbeatable. But by ignoring the subtleties of stagecraft, he left room for Arnold to cover up any conditioning flaws. It was the clash of Oliva's instinctive genius versus Schwarzenegger's calculated cunning. For the judges, the difference might have seemed small, but in a sport as subjective as bodybuilding, those nuances could decide everything. And that's exactly what happened in Essen. With his confident smile and precise gestures, Arnold projected control. Sergio, despite being in absolutely phenomenal shape, seemed less concerned with the politics of the stage and more focused on simply flexing his raw power. That psychological battle may have been just as intense as the physical one, and it drove home a critical lesson. At Olympia, it's not enough to look the best in the mirror. You've got to convince the judges and the crowd that you are the champion. Arnold understood this better than anyone, and that mindset shaped the outcome of that controversial night in Essen. When the competitors finally hit the stage, the audience got a front-row view of the stakes. And it was impossible to miss. Sergio Oliva was in one of the best shapes of his life. The Cuban giant displayed insane mass, an unbelievably tiny waist, powerful legs, and a back that seemed to go on forever. Many experts and athletes, including Zane, openly said it. Sergio had beaten Arnold that night. For some, this was the ultimate version of the myth. Arnold, by comparison, wasn't at his sharpest. His arms and chest didn't have the peak density he'd showcase in other years. But he made up for it with charisma and stage intelligence. His posture, his confident gaze, and his ability to manipulate perception turned an average prep into a winning performance. He knew, better than anyone, that Olympia wasn't just about muscle, it was about spectacle. But the night wasn't only about the main showdown. Serge Nubret, in his pro debut, was the breakout star. The Frenchman wowed with refined aesthetics, balanced proportions, and razor-sharp definition. Even without Arnold or Sergio's sheer size, he stood out and earned an impressive third place, announcing himself as a serious name to watch in the years ahead. Meanwhile, fourth place was a close battle between Zane and Franco Columbu. Zane, with his symmetry and clean conditioning, edged out Arnold's training partner. Franco, though only in fifth, impressed with his compact, rock-solid physique and freakish strength. Everyone knew the Italian was just getting started. His time would come. Edmund Karolwick's rounded out the lineup in sixth. His presence, thanks to Nubret's invite, was quiet and short-lived on the competitive scene, but it reinforced the growing international reach of Olympia, showing that the sport was no longer confined to its American roots. The contrast among these athletes made it crystal clear. The 1972 Olympia wasn't just a contest. It was a living mosaic of styles. On one side, Sergio's raw mass and genetic miracle. On the other, Arnold's strategy, charisma, and competitive IQ. And in between, rising stars like Nubret, Zane, and Columbu, who would go on to write their own chapters of glory. That diversity of physiques and personalities turned Essen into an unforgettable spectacle. Each athlete brought more than just muscle to the stage. They carried a story, a style, and a vision of what bodybuilding could be. After all the tension, comparisons, and mind games, the most anticipated moment of the night arrived: the announcement of the results. The Handelshof in Essen went silent as the crowd waited for the verdict from the 7 judges. Every vote would shape not only that night's champion, but the very direction of bodybuilding's golden era. When the decision was finally revealed, the arena erupted with mixed reactions. With 4 votes in his favor, Arnold Schwarzenegger was declared the winner, taking home his 3rd consecutive Mr. Olympia title. Along with the glory came a $2,000 prize, a modest sum by today's standards, but back then it symbolized the recognition of Olympia as the ultimate stage in the bodybuilding world. In second place, Sergio Oliva was announced as runner-up. The Cuban, who many believed had displayed the best physique of his life, couldn't sway the majority of the judges. For part of the audience, and even for some athletes like Zane, the result felt unjust. It was as if the myth had been crowned morally, even without the trophy in his hands. In third place, Serge Nubret made his international debut with a splash. His elegant aesthetics and flawless proportions weren't enough to topple the two titans of the main rivalry, but they earned him instant respect and loud applause from the crowd. Many were already predicting that the Frenchman would return in future Olympias to fight for titles. The battle for fourth place went to Frank Zane. His clean, symmetrical presentation gave him the edge over Franco Columbu, who had to settle for fifth. Still, both left Essen stronger. Zane proved he could shine in a lineup dominated by much larger physiques, while Franco showed that with a few tweaks, he was capable of climbing much higher in the future. Closing out the lineup, Edmund Karolwick's landed in sixth. While he didn't make much competitive noise, his presence reinforced the event's international reach, symbolizing Olympia's expansion beyond the traditional bodybuilding hotbeds. And so, the 1972 Olympia officially recorded Arnold's victory, Sergio's frustration, and the revelation of fresh new talent. But more than the scoreboard, what truly stuck was the lingering sense of controversy. After all, a 4-3 split among the judges showed just how close and how debatable that showdown had been. If the 1972 Olympia went down in history, it wasn't just for the epic clash between two giants. It was also for the decades-long controversy that followed. The decision split not only the crowd in Essen, but also athletes and experts across bodybuilding. For many, Arnold Schwarzenegger's win didn't reflect what was actually displayed on stage. Among the most outspoken was Frank Zane. Competing that very night, he openly declared that Sergio Oliva had been superior. According to Zane, the Cuban showcased unmatched shape, with lines, proportions, and conditioning that put the final result in doubt. And he wasn't alone. Many athletes and fans echoed the same view. Writer and historian Jerry Branham later backed this consensus in interviews. He recalled that in conversations with other bodybuilders and witnesses, the prevailing impression was the same. Sergio had outshined Arnold. For many, that Olympia should have been Oliva's fourth title. The narrative of a robbed victory began to grow and became inseparable from the event's legacy. Not everyone agreed, though. Franco Columbu, Arnold's close friend and training partner, was one of the few voices defending the legitimacy of the outcome. To Columbu, Arnold's stage presence and command made him deserving of the win. But to most, his defense sounded more like loyalty and friendship than an objective take. This division highlighted just how subjective bodybuilding judging can be. Unlike sports with objective scoring, Olympia results hinge on the judges' interpretations of often subtle criteria. And it was in that gray area that the controversy was born and took root. Over time, the 1972 Olympia came to be remembered not only as a great spectacle, but as one of the most disputed results in the history of the sport. The Olympia of 1972 didn't end when the lights went out at the Handelshof. In reality, that event became a turning point with ripple effects that stretched throughout the entire decade. For Arnold Schwarzenegger, the victory in Essen cemented his dominance. It wasn't just his third straight win. It was a statement that he was ready to own the Olympia stage for years. And that's exactly what he did. Between 1973 and 1975, he extended his streak, and in 1980, he returned, again in controversial fashion, to claim his final Olympia crown. For Sergio Oliva, however, the loss was far too bitter. Convinced he'd been robbed, the myth left the IFBB right after the event. His frustration ran so deep that he wouldn't return to Olympia for 11 years, until 1984. That long absence left a huge gap in the golden era and only fueled the myth that he could have written a very different history had he stayed. Meanwhile, Serge Nubret, Frank Zane, and Franco Columbu took full advantage of the spotlight they earned in Essen to build solid and unforgettable careers. Nubret kept dazzling crowds with his classic aesthetics. Zane proved to the world that symmetry and refinement could also reign supreme, winning 3 Olympia titles in the late 70s. And Columbu, with his unmatched strength, reached the top in 1976 and again in 1981. Together, they helped diversify and enrich bodybuilding's golden era. Over time, the 1972 edition became cemented as one of the most legendary moments in Olympia history. For many, it was the ultimate showdown between Arnold and Sergio, a clash that symbolized two different types of greatness: the Austrian strategic genius versus the Cuban's raw genetic dominance. That battle showed the world that bodybuilding wasn't decided only in the mirror, but also on stage, with presence, psychology, and even a bit of backstage politics. What we saw in Essen was more than muscles flexing under spotlights. It was living proof that charisma, intelligence, and mind games could weigh just as much as biceps and lats when it came time for the final decision. That realization changed how athletes prepared, shaping a new understanding that Olympia was just as much a show as it was a competition. It's no surprise, then, that many historians and fans still call the 1972 Olympia one of the greatest and most controversial contests of all time. Its legacy goes far beyond Arnold's victory or Sergio's frustration. It represents a moment when the sport matured, confronted its contradictions, and learned how to live with them. So, did you enjoy going back in time with us to relive that epic Olympia battle of 1972? This was one of those moments that remind us bodybuilding is way more than just muscles. It's rivalry, strategy, emotion, and of course, history worth telling. If you're into this kind of content, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, because it really helps the channel grow and shows you value the golden era too. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we've got a full Olympia timeline coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single detail. If you'd like to support the project even more, consider becoming a channel member. You'll help us keep producing videos at this level, plus get early access to exclusive content. Now I want to hear from you. In your opinion, who really won in 1972? Did Arnold deserve the title, or was Sergio robbed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'll keep this debate alive, because it's one that still sparks passion across generations. And don't click away just yet. On the end screen, you'll see another episode from our Mr. Olympia series. Click it and keep traveling with us through bodybuilding history, because with every contest, new legends are born and fresh controversies rise. See you in the next chapter of this epic saga.